We wanted to just kill some time with some informational updates. Jamie, you want to take it away?
Sure. So just wanted to flag for everyone that this Saturday, June 15th from 9 to 12:30 is Neighborhood Council Budget Day. It will be at City Hall. Will feature a panel moderated by Kate Cagle. There's going to be speaking moments by Kenneth Mejia, Bob Blumenfield, Matthew Zabo, Rick Cole, and James Finney Conlon. It also will feature a free breakfast. So I would encourage you to register if you're interested in learning more about the budget process, if you're learning and interested in how you can get more involved with the budget process. The Neighborhood Council Budget Advocates is an outgrowth of the Neighborhood Council system that are dedicated solely to looking at the budget and the departments each year producing a white paper. I am a budget advocate, so full disclosure, but I've found it to be a really useful organization for understanding the budget and being able to sort of look critically at different departments. So if that's something you have an interest in, I'd encourage you to join and get involved.
And to
Then
be clear, you do not need to be an NC member or in any way affiliated with the neighborhood council to attend the event. And you also do not need to necessarily be a neighborhood council member to be involved with budget advocates. So,
correct. And all the meetings are open to the public that they have, and you don't technically have to be on a neighborhood council to be a budget advocate. You can be appointed by your neighborhood council, and then it's a process. Like, but you don't necessarily have to be on a neighborhood council to be a budget advocate. And then I also wanted to flag in the next slide that there's an upcoming meeting of the Ethics Commission. I don't know if you could display it. But there's an upcoming meeting of the Ethics Commission on June 26th. It's expected that there will be discussions on the revisions to the donation disclosure threshold policy. Currently, if you donate in aggregate $100 or more to any candidate, that's when it would be disclosed. The Ethics Commission is looking at considerations for lowering that disclosure threshold. And then also to who that lowering would apply to. Would it just be to committees? Would it be to ballot measures? Would it be to IEs? And that's the only they haven't released the agenda yet, so that's the only thing that we really do know for certain will be talked about at the next meeting. And that's on June 26th.
well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Our main event is to talk about 1999 charter reform. So, as our city is looking towards our first comprehensive reforms in about 25 years, this is a good time to look back. If we can go over to the next slide. First things first, I wanted to flag that if you want to learn more about 1999 charter reform, uh, Rafe Sonnenschein, former director of the Pat Brown Institute, he was the executive director of the appointed Charter Reform Commission. He was also part of the LA Governance Reform Project that was looking at charter reforms over the last couple of years. He has the definitive book on charter reform, The City at Stake. This is something that I was able to get off Amazon for a few dollars used. But Jamie was looking at the book the other day, and I didn't even realize like it's really gone up dramatically in price, and it's like 3 times that, or 10 times that. So definitely a good book to have on hand just to get to know the city structure and really get in depth on these things. There were a lot of really wonky issues that were explored there that we're not going to be getting deep into tonight. If we were to go and give that kind of exhaustive presentation, this would take hours upon hours. So that is definitely a book that if you're interested in the city of LA or charter reform, you got to get your hands on. There is also LA Structure of a City that he put together. And this is a free ebook that you can download online from the League of Women Voters of Greater LA. Ray Sonnenschein wrote this thing, and it provides Basically, if you were looking for an LA government 101, a really, really amazing resource to get to know the history of different departments. It also has, a lot on the history of City of LA, how it's evolved, expanded. There's all kinds of good stuff on, the same subject matter as a city at stake, but it's just a really great resource to have, even though it is very much outdated. It's just something that I have a copy sitting next to me and a copy via PDF that I turn to quite a bit. And on,
Rob, can we get the link for the free ebook
yes, we will
posted
drop
in
that in
chat?
the chat.
Thank you.
And on the next slide, um, as you might know, our charter is basically the constitution for the city. It's intended for big structural things that we can only change via the approval of a majority of voters of the city of LA. Last month, we talked about the Cohen Commission from 1989 that put together big charter ethics reforms. The executive director is Andra Caden. She also went on, I believe, either before or after that, I don't remember which one, but was with the League of Women Voters of Greater of LA. She put together a report that was released a number of months after that that went into recommendations for charter reform and updating our charter and looking at it because it had been so long. We were dealing with the old charter from 1925, and Councilmember Ruth Galanter issued a motion to explore that. The city actually went as far as putting together a study group to look at, what we might want to cover in charter reform, what kind of commission should we have, what kind of funding should they have, and they said, let's do a 21-member commission, let's give it huge resources, and ultimately we had the riots. And a combination of the riots and budget crunch in the city just kind of put that all on the back burner. So it got very close to we got very close to having this charter reform conversation before Mayor Reardon was even in office. Um, On to the next slide. There are a number of things that inspired the charter reform movement, but Mayor Reardon was really a very key player in this whole thing. He came into office in 1993. This was after Mayor Bradley had served 20 years in office. We had Mayor Reardon for the first time. We're seeing how things are going to pan out. And when Mayor Bradley came into office, we had a fierce, racist, dirty, mudslinging race between Bradley and Yorty. And this was the first real kind of open playing field in that office in decades. So Michael Wu, he was the one that chaired the governance reform committee back in the day and shepherded through those ethics reforms. He was the chosen one from Mayor Bradley to succeed him. He was not well liked by his colleagues, and John Ferraro, the council president, actually endorsed Mayor Reardon against Michael Wu. Mayor Reardon, very much portrayed as an outsider to some, but really was an insider. He came into politics as somebody that was a wealthy lawyer, investor, and had some money to throw around, and significantly bankrolled uh, some of Mayor Bradley's runs for governor. And he found his way onto some commissions and was very much involved in the fundraising circuit. Um, a Republican, but very much pro-choice, supportive of gay rights. Even though very much liked by people in the valley, he was somebody who lived out in like Brentwood. Um, he Before coming into office, actually forced charter reform onto the table. Um, he was very much an advocate of term limits and put that on the ballot in 1993. That was not something that council was looking forward to, but they were forced to put a competing measure on the ballot because of the initiative that Mayor Reardon supported. That ultimately succeeded. The council version got greater support, so that one prevailed. If we can go on to the next slide. And there are a number of reasons for charter reform. The biggest one is not on this slide, but just generally speaking, we were dealing with an extremely old document that not a whole lot of thought went into when we were making updates to it. So we ended up with something extremely, extremely long and overly detailed. A lot of things that you would assume should be in an ordinance, so it's not fixed in there, was just kind of casually thrown into the charter. There were even references in the charter that led to nowhere because they didn't do a good job of understanding what was there and what they were changing. Another reason that we saw a need for charter reform is over the years since 1925, there'd been a number of ways that council had slowly chipped away at the mayor's power. And going back to 1925, we had a system that was really dominated by commissions and department heads. The department heads had civil service protection. Um, the commissioners had a whole lot of influence, and not nearly as much influence as you do see today from our mayors. Um, the one something that was really big was in 1991, Mayor Bradley accidentally signed a charter measure that he didn't support. He allegedly, like, apparently, intended to veto this proposal from the council, but sent it forward and wasn't able to take it back. And that was Prop 5. And it basically said that council has the ability to not just veto a planning commission decision, but they can actually completely rewrite it. So that just really, 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 really undermined the work of the commissions, and by virtue of that, the actual kind of influence of a mayor. We don't see that anymore. This was something that was changed in the 99 charter reform process. One exception to that is with planning decisions. There is a special line in there that says that council can rewrite planning commission decisions. One thing that as I mentioned, John Ferraro supported Mayor Reardon. He was not like a stranger to City Hall, and there was a strong relationship early on that fizzled out. And one of the kind of catalyzing events, there was a number of recommendations from Mayor Reardon on reorganizing city departments, and council just basically didn't even touch it, didn't get a hearing. So that was something that just kind of put the writing on the wall. Mayor Reardon wasn't planning on starting the charter reform process until the second term, but secession was the big turning point, which we'll cover on the next slide. So the Valley has grown exponentially in the post-World War II era. As you know, there were a lot of farms out there. Agriculture was pretty big, but open land in post-World War II era just offered all kinds of room to grow. And as a result of that, you had a growing influence in the Valley vote, something that really first kind of burst onto the scene with Sam Yorty, the conservative mayor that we've talked about previously. We also saw that in the Prop 13. There was a really big anti-tax push, and Council District 12, that Northwest Valley area, was just kind of the bastion for conservatism in the LA area. That was also in there with Prop 187, a really divisive issue that highlighted the divide that we see across this city, and also helped inspire the Latino community to get a whole lot more involved in the wake of the anti-immigrant push. And again, we saw Mayor Reardon come into office in large part because what kind of base he had in the Valley generally, but also specifically in that West Valley area. We also saw changing demographics in the city. This used to be an extremely, extremely white city. And we used to have a much larger African-American population than we do now. We saw a growth in the 90s in the Latino population, in particular, really heavy boom in growth in the East Valley. And you might have noticed in the last redistricting session we went through, That's kind of spilled over, and we're seeing the West Valley grow substantially now. There's And please, if there's anything that you would like to, any questions you have, feel free to raise your hand or drop it in the chat. Ross is keeping an eye on that. And Ross, please, if there are any questions in there, throw them out there.
Like,
There's always been this threat of secession. And in 1977, the city of LA worked with the state legislature to basically put in a veto on any kind of secession movement. And then Bob Hertzberg was in the legislature at the time and was one of the leaders that decided to undo that. And the city was forced to come to the table and try to kind of set up some parameters for how that would happen. Specifically, if there were sufficient signatures, you'd have an election. The measure would have to succeed in the area leaving, and it would have to succeed for the city as overall. There are also requirements to study, what kind of financial impact this would have on the area seceding as well as the city as a whole. So they had the writing on the wall. Ultimately, that was repealed in 1997, but that was something in the works in the year or so prior to that. So the reality that secession was potentially coming up for a vote forced everybody to look at what is our city, what are we doing, how can we improve this city, but also offer the valley maybe some renewed hope in what we're able to provide. The next slide, please. So there was a lawyer in the valley, this guy David Fleming, and he thought, all right, what if charter reform is the way that we can hedge off this secession movement? So he tried to pitch Councilmember Mike Fuhr, our recent city attorney, who you might know from corruption scandals. But if you were looking at Mike Fuhr 25 years ago, he was the goody two shoes on the council that everybody kind of hated because he was so high and mighty and ethical and idealistic. So he was the head of the rules committee. Again, notable because you would never see that with our council today. The council president puts themselves in charge of any of those relevant committees. But Mike Fuhr was in charge of the rules committee that handled reform stuff. So David Fleming pitched him on the idea of, we will support what you're moving towards, but this commission needs to have the power to put something on the ballot. Everybody had the kind of recognition that council wasn't going to be serious about reform, and they didn't want reform to end at a dead end. And initially, James Hahn, the city attorney at the time, said that council could not give them that authority. And ultimately, he had a change of heart and completely reversed himself and said that they could, in part because it really ended negotiations, and this lawyer went ahead and started the ballot initiative process to get an elected commission created. So that forced council to start to act. There was an attempt to kind of find some compromise, and Mayor Reardon was able to get an agreement with John Ferraro, but ultimately the council was not down, and they put in a substitute motion, moved it forward with a 10-3 vote, and that was the end of that, basically. Mayor Reardon from that point boycotted the commission, and the signature gathering campaign went forward. And on the next slide, we'll be talking about the elected commission. So the elected commission has a number of dynamics with it, and mainly in that it takes some time. You have to gather the signatures, same number of signatures as if you were putting a charter measure on the ballot. And then you have to have elections held. And on that same election, the voters of LA decide, do we want to create a commission or not? And then there's a list of candidates. Those candidates have no contribution limits. So when you're, giving money to a mayoral candidate or a city council candidate, there's a limit to how much money you can give them. That is not the case for these elected commissioners. So it is very much a special interest field game. There's also, no real clarity on how the commission was supposed to come in there. The Constitution says that there's 15 commissioners. Um, it it was presumed that they were to be run at large, where all 15 are chosen by all of the voters. And then there's also the California Voting Rights Act at play that says that, is very much inclined towards district elections. So the city attorney, advised that they should probably have district elections. So we ended up with district elections. That makes it a whole lot harder to field candidates. And that was something that, again, helped, interests out there with big money. There was also a question of, do we have to have runoffs or not? Something not clear at the time. So we ended up, for a number of these races, having to have runoffs if nobody got 50%. Ultimately, the question of should we create an elected commission got 61% support. And I just a really notable dynamic there was that labor recognized this thing was going to pass, and they focused a lot of resources on finding good candidates to get on there. People with name recognition, one of them, Janice Hahn, the sister of the city attorney. They fielded a number of really, really good candidates and dominated that, which for Mayor Reardon, coming at things from a more conservative perspective, he ended up with a commission less favorable than the appointed commission that the city council put together. Because he was the mayor, he had the ability to influence and win people over. So just a really notable dynamic there as far as what he was hoping for and what he ended up with. On to the next slide. Thank you. So we had two very, very different commissions operating back then. We had a lot of future politicians on there. I mentioned Janice Hahn. You also had Gloria Romero, who ran for, or successfully got in the legislature not long after that, and Dennis Zine. He was the one of the heads of the LA Police Union, and he ultimately served quite a bit of time on the city council after that. They had a chair that was very much influential and qualified, and not all commissioners are the same. They ended up with a really good chair in Erwin Chemerinsky. The notable thing about the elected commission is they had a lot of mouths to feed and a lot of egos. All of these people came to the table feeling like, I have a mandate. And that made it a whole lot harder to find consensus than on the appointed commission. They also really had a dream to go big. It was a very visionary body that kind of looked at it like, we're drawing a new constitution up. Whereas the appointed commission had the advantage of having a big head start. They didn't have to wait for elections or anything. So they had a significant time as far as a head start to do the early work. They also had early funding. One of the big issues early on was, does the elected commission get any funding or not? And that ultimately, kind of made the rivalry between the two a whole lot more antagonistic. There was always a competition for media and attention. The mayor really did not engage with the appointed commission, whereas the appointed commission really heavily engaged with the city council and all of the different city departments, and really looked at the structure of the city very, very closely. And because they had that detail-oriented perspective, ultimately, when the two commissions finally came together, they had to look to both of their documents as far as, okay, well, what do we base this off of for drafting this thing up? And the appointed commission had done enough work where it was It wasn't a non-controversial decision, but it was a pretty logical decision. The next slide. So the charter priorities, there was a kind of a general recognition that we maybe have to have a more effective mayor with a bit more power and authority. There was also a desire to have enhanced local participation, but there really wasn't a consensus on how we do that. Some people believed a whole lot more in the council size end of things. And there was also, all of the candidates that ran for the elected commission for the most part campaigned heavily on creating the neighborhood council system. The mayor went into this game with a whole lot of really big reforms that he was envisioning. He wanted to change the relationship where instead of the chief administrative officer, he's the top manager in the city. He would only report to the mayor and not report to both the mayor and the city council. The mayor wanted to have some sort of role in litigation. Previously, that was just a council thing. There was also the Prop 5 issue I mentioned before, the council's ability to not only veto, but completely rewrite a commission decision. There was a desire to, be able to more easily get rid of department managers. Previously, they could remove a manager, but the council had to approve it with a majority vote. Something that really, really limited the mayor's ability to have kind of clear authority. We used to have department heads were a whole lot more opinionated and willing to buck the system or dismiss people in city hall, which made it a whole lot more difficult to manage some things. There was also a desire to have more clear authority with emergency powers. Remember that we had the earthquake in the 90s, and that was very much something on people's minds when they were thinking about emergency powers and how to really lay that out. The mayor wanted to also have a clear designation as the person to deal with like intergovernmental relations. If they were dealing with another country or a state, just kind of the political diplomacy thing, like having a clear authority to speak on issues was something that was desired. They also wanted to increase the number of exempt positions that don't need to go through the lengthy civil service hiring process. They wanted to have a greater authority to staff up certain departments on a whim. Something that was also really big, they wanted to have the first stab at some performance audits. This was something that eventually was taken off the table, and there was a compromise with the city controller to give them the clear authority to have performance audits. But there was a whole lot that the mayor was trying to gobble up in this list of things that really amounted to quite a bit. The other really big thing they wanted to see changed is have the city attorney be an appointed position. And have, for an elected city attorney, them just be focused on misdemeanors. So all in all, a lot of really big things there. And ultimately, Mayor Reardon got very few of these, which is just kind of amusing. On the next slide.
So neighborhood councils and the idea of neighborhood councils for Los Angeles came out of these charter conversations. On the one hand, you had people talking about increasing council size as one way of increasing local participation, but neighborhood councils were another way that was championed for people to have more of a voice at City Hall. And when you look at it in the framework of the secession movement, I think is what's particularly important, because what people described is probably not an experience that's dissimilar to what many people experience today, but that you would have people traveling from the valley, from the harbor region, to go to City Hall to speak, only to discover that their item had been moved to another meeting, or that there was very little discussion at council over their items, very little opportunity for input. It was often described as an insider versus outsider game. And part of the call to sort of stop the secession movement was to give more opportunity to the outside game. Before the reform movement, there was a patchwork of advisory groups to city council. Notably, and perhaps most notably, was Mark Ridley Thomas and his Empowerment Congress, which I think in many ways influences what we see with neighborhood councils today. He was spending about a third of his discretionary funds on the Empowerment Congress, and often hundreds of people would turn out each year for that meeting of those South LA neighborhoods to weigh in on what priorities should be. But you also had Mike Fior had his Robertson Area Advisory Council, and you also had Hal Burnson in the 12th District had advisory bodies as well. Ironically, one of the biggest advocates within the neighborhood council for the neighborhood council system was Joel Walks, who didn't have any advisory positions, and that was something that he got a little bit of flack for from his colleagues. If we could go to the next slide. So some of the biggest questions that were had essentially was, what kind of authority would the neighborhood councils have? Would they be elected or would they be appointed? One of the things that you have to with the elected versus appointed is many people felt that if they were appointed by these elected officials, it would simply be a continuation of sort of the same voices in City Hall, and not really having people who weren't already part of the insider status to have a voice. However, if you go with elected, at the time of charter reform, so I think it's about 1/3 of the citizens of LA were not US citizens, so they lacked voting power. So that was one of the things that was grappled with was, do you want to have a body that can have that wouldn't otherwise be able to participate in elections, or do you want something that's appointed by a city council authority? Another big point of contention was land use authority. There were many that wanted the neighborhood councils to have a significant role in land use authority, and that was very debated, and I'm going to go into that a little bit later. But there was also this idea of decision-making authority versus advisory. And what we have right now in the neighborhood council system is we have an advisory body that is elected, but our elections are really self-selections, which allows us to get around this idea of being municipally elected, which allows for a broader participation of residents in those elections. And when they looked at other bodies that had sort of a neighborhood council-esque structure, what they found was that all of those bodies, with the exception of Washington, D.C., which had a little bit around alcohol permits, all of them were advisory only. And so that appetite for giving neighborhood councils decision-making authority that did initially exist went away when they found out that nowhere else in the nation had this. And it was Greg Nelson, who actually eventually was one of the general managers of Dunn, who gave this idea of an advisory self-selected bodies. And that means each neighborhood council, when it essentially became incorporated under the city, it devised its own rules for how people would be elected. And that's why each neighborhood council has different kinds of seats, different kinds of qualifications, and different kinds of people that can hold that seats. You may have one neighborhood council that has all at-large representatives, which is a fairly broad category, or you might have a neighborhood council that has a mix such as community interest stakeholder, resident stakeholder, religious group stakeholder. It all really depends on what each neighborhood council feels represents them the best. And we're not municipally elected, which is why we don't have to comply with many of the same campaign finance rules and disclosures. And if we could go to the next slide. So it was really interesting to look at how, when this was being discussed, the different oppositions that appeared, and the things that people sort of thought they would be for. In particular, the LA Business Alliance was very opposed to neighborhood councils because they sort of assumed that they would be anti-growth, anti-development. The homeowner groups were very interested in it because they wanted land use authority. Latino voting groups were had large opinions on the neighborhood council system because they saw the neighborhood council system as a way to, one, have folks be able to participate that might not be able to, but also there was a large factor that didn't want council expansion. Sorry, they wanted they didn't want neighborhood councils because they wanted council expansion because they wanted more minority participation and representation on council. You also saw labor and construction opposition because again they thought it was going that neighborhood councils would be inherently anti-growth. But you also had folks like Tom Hayden and Jackie Goldberg from more left-wing side of things that were really pushing to have the ability for more outside groups to weigh in. If we could go to the next slide. But the concept of neighborhood councils was very, very popular. When they did polling on it, it had a 78% approval rate. But ultimately, much of the detail about neighborhood councils was actually left back to city council. When you look at Article 9 of the charter, it's actually not very detailed in what we can do and what our limitations are. And in my opinion, that has been something that's been exploited a bit as we've gone on. But it was the rejection of this idea of true decision-making power for neighborhood councils, particularly around land use, which led to the opening for area planning commissions, which were something that was also new with this charter.
Mhm. And that brings it to me with the issue of land use and just to this issue of whether or not neighborhood councils could potentially have land use power was a huge flashpoint in the debates over the charter, in part because of the way land in LA had been planned and discussed to begin with. Very basically, the land use system was that had been in place since the late 1960s was criticized as highly complex, extremely centralized, and completely out of the hands of average citizens. And I just highlight those are the big three critiques: complex, centralized, elite. And if you look at this very relatively very rough, abstract kind of version of all the different bodies that were involved with land use before the charter reform, it does look relatively simple. But if you start to count it up, you realize the number of people, the number of politicians, the number of parts of the city that are all having input here are actually relatively large. Also, pretty much all of these do not actually involve very many people. They certainly don't involve many citizens, and they don't allow citizen input. For instance, the Board of Zoning Appeals and the Planning Commission were all five-person committees, all of which were appointed by the mayor. The General Plan Advisory Board was actually made up entirely of department heads. The Office of Zoning Administration was all civil servants. And as you can see, the mayor and city council were still ultimately where the buck stopped for anything in particular. So the APCs, or area planning commissions that were proposed during the reform, were meant to kind of act as a counterweight to the planning commission to finally allow for more bodies for local citizen input. And that being said, they were also meant to consolidate the system at least a little bit, as the charter reform also removed the Board of Zoning Appeals, and they were meant to address the concerns of the Valley about representation. 7 area planning commissions were eventually created in the charter. The Valley had 2 APCs, whereas all the other parts of the city only had 1. Another concern of the Valley was about who in the city was able to have input about Valley land decisions. Members of these area planning commissions had to be residents of the areas that they governed. But that being said, the Valley remained skeptical that ordinances could be used to circumvent the process because so many of the details of this new system were not actually put in the charter. In the proposed charter, they were to be created by ordinance at a later time. Um, uh, it is also the reality, just before we move on, that ultimately all of these area planning commissions were still to be filled with appointees by the mayor themselves. So, uh, but part of why the APCs were created was to get the issue of land use adjudication kind of off the table. Um, the to ensure that land use was addressed more generally. Jamie already mentioned all the different players involved and some of the strange alliances, but it was particularly interesting that the pro land use side involved business from the valley working with homeowners, whereas unions, downtown businesses, and nonprofits of all entities ended up being against something that was billed as potentially improving representation in land use processes. And as mentioned, the members remained appointees to go back to and evaluate our original critique of the older system as complex, centralized, and elite. Also, area planning commissions were only supposed to address issues of local concern, and there remained valid concerns that this would be used as a legal loophole to ensure that aspects of land use that should be addressed by APCs could simply be legally scooped out of their domain. And those concerns were for a valid reason, because all of the APC's decisions could still be appealed to the Central Department of City Planning, and those could then be appealed to City Council. So, and finally, as you might have realized, going back quickly to our chart, ultimately the only group that was eliminated was the Board of Zoning Appeals, and it was replaced with 7 different entities across the city. So the question of whether or not this ultimately made things less or more complex, is difficult to decide. The other major flashpoint was, of course, the issue of council size. And a 35-member council would mean about 1 representative per 100,000 residents, aka like every other large city in the country. It also could diffuse Valley arguments around representation, because it would mean the Valley could have about 10 to 13 seats, and it could, of course, increase ethnic representation across the city. But there was pushback. Some parts of the Valley argued there was a danger that if there were more members, it would fragment local communities too much to make decision-making happen. And there was a familiar argument made that too many members would actually dilute minority representation and end up violating the Voting Rights Act. So all of those arguments against did spook the commissions a bit. The elected commission adopted a 25-member plan, but the appointed commission was even more concerned about potential unforeseen consequences of improving representation, and they favored a compromise of 21 members. And of course, between 21 and 25 members, you'd think that'd be easy to compromise on, but instead they ended up at an impasse, and almost put an end to negotiations around their combined charter in the first place. So the solution was to let the people decide. But as part of that compromise, there was a complication. One of the proposals had to get at least half the vote. And when we look at the documents from that time period, we see a lot of pushback. People were really concerned about increased costs. I think we can see from the all caps commentary, they also saw city council as dysfunctional. And also, if you look at reports from focus groups at that time, I think we see really clearly that the advocates, the political groups, the politicians who were involved in the reform were really enthusiastic. And ordinary Angelenos just weren't. They actually saw this issue as very clearly robbing them of representation. And it's finally impossible to avoid the reality that 2 dueling proposals just made this issue substantially more difficult and confusing to think through at the ballot box, let alone advocate for. And with that, I will turn it back to this compromise unified charter. Rob?
So ultimately, both of the charter reform commissions, we're able to recognize that we're better off sending one thing forward. And they both had mutual interest in this. For the appointed commission, it was, hey, if we hitch up with the elected commission, we can get through things that the council would never want to put on. And the elected commission could see that if we were able to come together, we're going to have a much better chance with the voters than if we're undercutting each other. Council ultimately found themselves on the sidelines to some extent. It took a couple months. There was a whole lot of drama and back and forth between the two commissions, even a point at which it looked like it was dead. But ultimately, they were able to put together a unified charter. And Jamie went over some of the major sticking points as well as Ross. There were other issues as far as some people in the valley and some people from the elected commission world believing we need to have a completely independent redistricting commission. There was also a huge divide on what to do with the mayor's authority to remove commissioners and department heads. And the net result was that the mayor could remove commissioners as they pleased, with the exception of a few limited commissions. And for department heads, previously the mayor was required to get a majority approval of the council. Instead, for most of the departments, the mayor could remove somebody, and the council could only override it with a 2/3 vote. So it required the department head to make an appeal and the council to come in with a 2/3 vote. There were also some things tucked in there that we've not covered today that are interesting as well. We had a whole lot of mess in the 90s with LAPD. And after the Rodney King beating, they created the Christopher Commission. And that was something that set up some civilian oversight. Ultimately, they found that the inspector general was not fully empowered. And we had chiefs of police and police commissioners that were not compliant with the inspector general. So there were some things tucked in here to give more clear authority to the inspector general. And to also set up some limits so that that if there were officer discipline happening, that the chief of police couldn't meddle with that process and communicate off the record. There was a council actually put the thing forward on the ballot, but as I said, they really didn't have a choice. They were forced to the table, and all but even though pretty much everybody, it was a unanimous vote. One of the members was not present for it out of protest, but ultimately only 3 members would support this thing at the ballot. Everybody else was opposed to it. If we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the results. The charter succeeded with 60% support, and this chart is from Professor Schonenstein's book that I mentioned. And you can see the darker areas are the areas that the charter did extremely well, and the white areas give you an idea of where it did not do so well. And you can see that area that stretches the west side upwards towards the south of the valley, the southernmost kind of band there. There's a significant Jewish population that has traditionally been very favorable towards government's reform. This is where it did extremely well. You can see it did better in the East Valley than the West Valley. You can also see that it did better in the east side of Los Angeles compared to South LA, did extremely poorly in South LA. And the next slide will cover the council size issue. Both of these measures ultimately failed. 21 members got 37% support, and 25 members got 36% support. And you can see the same sort of trends here for the most part. And it's just it's fascinating to see this. We're 30 years removed, but Fair Rep LA did a poll on this stuff last year, and it's not significant enough in numbers to really break down by council district, but just looking by general region, you can get a feel for it. And we see the same things there, where it's doing really well in certain communities and doing much more poorly in others. And you can see these same sort of trends happening when you look at, the electoral performance of Mayor Bass versus Rick Caruso a couple years ago. The next slide, please. So lessons learned from the whole process. The biggest thing is that you do need to have widespread community engagement. We probably would not, it's not enough to overcome council obstruction, but we would not have been able to get the two commissions to come together without that public support and buy-in. There was very much a desire to have this work product go forward and respect all of the community engagement and involvement. Um, Something that we had there was a mayor really committed to the issue of reform. And that's not necessarily something that we have at the present moment with Mayor Bass. Mayor Bass is very much focused on the issue of homelessness and building up LAPD back in numbers. This is not something that's at the top of her agenda. And if we were to see this charter reform process move forward over the next 2 years, um, it's tough to see to imagine that the mayor is going to get extremely involved in that process in a way that pushes back against what council is doing. At least we're probably going to see a highly collaborative relationship with our future council president and Mayor Bass. Something that was really important in this process, absolutely crucial, was the elected commission having the ability to put something directly on the ballot. That gave them power, it gave them credibility, but it also took council out of the equation to some extent. It's not as though they didn't have to, pay attention to council and kind of make some concessions. The appointed commission very much drew some painful concessions out of them, but the elected commission being able to go around council is the reason we got something on the ballot. Council size, there's a lot of reason to Professor Sonnenschein, notes that it might have been a blessing to have council size removed from the overall charter question. It might not have passed if we had something, as unpopular as council size was at the time. I think something that's very different is in the 90s, they were pointing to corruption in Chicago or New York as the reason, we couldn't go to a larger council. And that really falls flat now when we have so many council members getting arrested in like this huge ethical cloud that hangs over the body. We also have a much more diverse population, and we also have a much larger voting base that is eligible to vote. That's a huge transformational thing, and something we saw in the polling last year was really strong support in the Latino community, which is much larger as far as the electorate than it was 30 years ago. The other thing that's of note, we had around like a little under 300,000 people voting in the election on this chart. That's barely over a single council district. So there's just a much larger, more representative electorate that we would have this question in front of. And Jamie, really quickly, if you want to just close us out on the NC angle.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit before about how much of the world building for neighborhood councils was left out of the charter and left to ordinance later. And I think what we've seen is a significant decrease in the support and help for neighborhood councils. They've had their budgets cut multiple times, even though those budgets are mostly supposed to be able to field essentially like their support tasks, which means more and more work has to go on to the neighborhood council board members, which makes it so that only a certain kind of person can participate. If you want to do some of the other things like doing events in your community or just paying the bills, essentially. We also have had problems that because we're advisory, it means we advise, but it does not in any way necessitate that city council will listen to that advice or even pay attention. Our community impact statements are filed on the council files, but that's really about the only guarantee that we have. Oftentimes neighborhood council members will call in with their CISs, but because we're relegated to general public comment, our voices are often not heard. We're supposed to be getting time at commissions and at city council, but that doesn't always happen. And it was actually discovered by me that for a period of a decade, in some cases, that our community impact statements weren't being sent to commissions because the city hadn't maintained the portal through which we submitted. That's it.
So that is our presentation on 99 charter reform. We have a few other things on the agenda, just informational updates. We'll keep them brief, but I wanted to just pause and see if anybody had any questions on 99 charter reform. Well, with that, let's hop over to state updates, Jamie.
Sure. So just a couple things that we're paying attention to at the state level. First off is the California Fair Elections Act. So that's AB 270 and SB 24. And there is going to be a hearing on that July 3rd. And this would put on the statewide ballot for 2026 to basically allow the public financing of elections. So if a city or county or municipality wanted to pursue public financing, they could. Then we have the Travel Disclose Act, which sadly seems to have been killed this round. That would have required essentially like when travel is being paid for by nonprofits above a certain spending level, I think it was 10,000 or 5,000 for one individual, that they would then have to disclose donors above $1,000 from the previous year. Then we have SB 1243, which is a campaign finance. Basically, that's going to is aiming to significantly amend SB 1439. SB 1439 was a really wonderful attempt at reducing pay to play opportunities, basically saying that if you gave $250 or more, then a council member couldn't vote on your item or your contract for a period of a year following. But SB 1243 is aiming to shorten that time frame. It is aiming to increase the amount of where it would be a prohibited donation. So they're really dramatically rolling it, attempting to dramatically roll it back from what it is right now. And if you look at the lobbying on that, you see lots of cities and counties that are like, yes, roll it back so that we can have more of that direct. Then you have AB 2455, which is whistleblower protection, basically aiming to expand that a bit so that it includes grants and loan programs that the government is getting, but also would expand whistleblowing investigation abilities over local agencies, employees, contractors, or subcontractors, which I actually think is a really important exclusion. And then AB 2839 and 2655, which are both looking at AI and deceptive election media. So basically putting prohibitions on the use of things like IEs or other campaigns to do things like creating a fake video using the rapidly expanding AI technologies.
And just want to plug our friends at the California Clean Money Campaign. They've got their hands and a bunch of these bills, leading and supporting various ones. Always appreciate their work. And there's all kinds of really easy to use petitions there that you can find a way to reach out to your reps and let them know how you feel about these bills. Ross, if you can throw us to the next slide, I'm going to try to just breeze through this. There is way too much to say here, and I'm honestly pretty burned out by City Hall right now, so maybe it's a good thing I don't have to get into it. But you might have seen last month that the ethics charter reforms that we'd worked so hard to get on the table in front of City Council got eviscerated at the full council. And just a really unfortunate thing. And we will see that up for a vote at City Council's Governance Reform Committee this Friday. They will also be looking at the Charter Reform Commission and finalizing the structure for that. Once that moves forward to the full council for a vote, the commission will be getting off the ground. They are also looking at other reforms for this November's ballot. And one of the things they almost threw on the table last week was reducing the number of meetings that we have. So that was something that thankfully did not move forward. Councilmember Rahman, Rodriguez, Lee, Padilla, and Blumenfield saved the day. A very odd assembly of council members, many from the conservative end of the spectrum, but very much appreciative of that, and we should all just wonder what it means to be a progressive these days. And there is still some outstanding work to be done on LAUSD redistricting. We will see that coming in front of the committee at some point soon, and that will have to get finalized in the next 3 weeks or so. So that is the city council updates, very bare bones. If you have any questions about where we are or any kind of specifics, please feel free to reach out. But with that, I just want to make sure we get out on time. And the only thing to really important thing to update, we'll get some new campaign finance updates at the end of July, but the fundraising window for 2026 citywide candidates is wide open right now. So anybody that wants to run for mayor, controller, or city attorney can get in the game and start fundraising. Last time I checked, nobody has filed yet, but that opened about a week and a half ago. So we will see what's happening there and talk a bit more about where things are fundraising wise and what new numbers are going to come out at our next meeting. But with that, we can just leave it there. If you've got to hop off, feel free to do so. If you have any questions or anything that you'd like to check in about, this is some open time right now, but yeah. Ross, Jamie, anything you want to add before we close?
Uh,
Nothing in particular, but I just saw in the chat that Jamie, you said it feels like you're in an episode of Groundhog Day with ethics reform. All I can say is it feels like I'm on an episode of Groundhog Day with council expansion, looking back at that history. So it's frustrating to see the same arguments come up over and over again decades later.
one thing that I wanted to flag that I just found out about this week was that neighborhood council elections, which traditionally had been an in-person event, but had moved to mail during COVID and then hybrid the year before, are being cut to mail only because of the budget cuts in the clerk's office, which is another really interesting thing. And I don't know if I like hybrid. Hybrid's great when you have options, but I'm not sure if mail in only, given that we don't get automated ballots for being on neighborhood council and it creates a much more of a process to actually obtain a ballot. I really wonder what the long-term effect on voting in neighborhood council elections will be with that step. I know when I ran in a mail-in one, I was going around with my neighbors with the stamps and the envelopes to make sure that they could mail in their request for a ballot. And it certainly assumes a certain level of keeping on top of things beyond just average voting. And yeah, so just flagging that on civic participation.
Wayne, your hand is up.
Wayne.
Sure. For those of you interested in what the California Clean Money Campaign is up to, you can go to caclean.org and you can see a lot of our stuff. I put it in the chat as well. And the particular clean money bill that's going forward right now is not going to affect Los Angeles because it's a charter city. It'll affect most of the other parts of the state that do not have the ability to have full public or partial public funding of elections. So thank you. Thank you for putting this on, you guys. Appreciate it.
Yes. We are lucky in Los Angeles because we are not only a charter city, but we got grandfathered in because we had a system in place before the ban came.
That's right.
Thank you all for joining. We will more than likely be back here the second Wednesday of July at 7 p.m. tentatively. Not sure what's on the agenda. Maybe we will bring in Trent Lang to talk to us about what's happening with the fun bills happening at a state level. But we will have something fun. Thank you for being here and have a great night.